Would you mind repeating what you just said, Emily? The lawyer's voice wavered, torn between amazement and incredulity. An eerie calm descended across the courtroom, which had been a hive just moments earlier. The little girl sitting on the witness stand with her legs just touching the chair's edge caught everyone's attention. The tattered fur of the teddy bunny she was holding in her arms suggested that it had been by her side through many storms. "Daddy didn't do it," Emily stated in a quiet but firm voice. "However, I am aware of who did." The courtroom was filled with gasps that sounded like waves hitting rocks. His gavel hovered uncertainly over the bench as the judge leaned forward. Tears were running down Emily's mother's cheeks as she covered her mouth with trembling hands. With a look of surprise, the prosecutor repositioned his spectacles and frantically went through his notes. For the first time in months, hope flickered in Emily's father's eyes as he glanced up in shock, even though he was seated at the defense table with black circles under his eyes. "Emily, could you please tell us who it was?" the lawyer gently pressed. As though seeking comfort, the young girl stroked her bunny's ear while looking down at it. "I can," she murmured quietly as she raised her head to look into everyone's eyes. However, the prosecutor leaped to his feet before she could continue. "Your Honor, objection!" he cried. The judge's gavel slammed, his voice echoed, "Order in the court!" But the tension in the chamber was evident, with each breath being held in suspense by Emily's next words. This wasn't always the case. The Thompson family was just like any other family on their quiet suburban neighborhood a few months ago. Playing in the park with her father Matt was Emily's favorite activity as an 8-year-old with a huge imagination. His kindness, humor, and willingness to go along with her imaginary adventures made him her idol. When her mother Sarah got home after her long shift as a nurse, their tiny home was alive with laughter and the aroma of freshly baked cookies. Everything changed one lovely summer evening while fireflies danced outside the living room window. As usual, Matt had put Emily into bed after kissing her goodnight, but the neighborhood was lighted by flashing blue and red lights before the sun rose. Matt was escorted out of the house in handcuffs as police cars lined the driveway. Emily cried out in her pajamas, "Daddy," as she ran down the stairs. "What's going on?" With a pale and strained face, Sarah drew her away. With her voice breaking, she said, "Go back to your room, sweetheart. It will be all right." However, it wasn't acceptable. Matt was charged with a crime that rocked their family to its foundations. Mr. Richards, a neighbor, had been attacked and left dead in his house. Witnesses reported seeing Matt leave the scene that evening. Matt's wallet was discovered close to the victim, and his fingerprints were on the back door handle, which appeared to be incriminating evidence. No one appeared to believe Matt when he insisted he was innocent. Whispers followed Sarah and Emily everywhere they went, and friends and neighbors began to avoid the Thompsons. Emily was treated like a leper by her classmates at school, and their parents warned them not to associate with a criminal's daughter. In an attempt to pay the rising legal fees, Sarah worked double shifts, but it was obvious that she was sinking. Emily made an effort to be courageous by covering her eyes and acting as though she didn't hear her mother sobbing at night. However, she secretly longed for her father and experienced loneliness like an unhealing wound. Emily once heard 2 police officers conversing outside the neighbor's house while she was playing in the backyard. Clutching like a spy in the bushes behind the fence, they failed to spot her. One officer remarked, "I don't feel comfortable with something about this case." The other person shrugged, "Perhaps, but the DA has sufficient evidence to convict him. Just the fingerprints." The first cop cut in, "But even so, I can't stop thinking about those other break-ins. No arrests, same neighborhood, same MO. What if—" The others were not heard by Emily. As she rushed inside to tell her mother, her mind was racing, but Sarah was too exhausted and stressed to pay attention. She rubbed her temples and murmured, "Not now, honey. This is too much for me to handle at this time." Emily felt powerless, but as she cuddled her bunny under the blankets that night, a thought started to take shape. Despite her lack of knowledge of the law and facts, she was certain that her father was innocent and would have to prove it herself if no one else could. The weeks that followed were a haze of modest, covert braveries. Emily took notes in her diary while paying close attention to adult interactions. Despite their seeming innocence, her questions were anything but. One time, while posing as if she was looking for the restroom, she even crept into her dad's lawyer's office and saw the case papers on his desk. She was particularly struck by one detail. The victim, Mr. Richards, had just gotten into a financial argument with another neighbor. Emily recalled spotting Mr. Baldwin, a sour old widower, skulking around the neighborhood late at night. She wondered if he could be involved, and her heart raced. But how was she going to prove it? No one would listen to her because she was only a young child. When Sarah arrived home late one evening, the answer was a surprise. Emily was scrolling through the TV stations when she came across a drama set in a courtroom. She watched with wide eyes as a young witness, despite the fact that it was frightening, took the stand and said the truth. The lawyer remarked, "Sometimes even the smallest voices can speak the loudest," as the audience in the show gasped. Emily held on to her rabbit. She might be able to accomplish it too. Emily pleaded with her mother to allow her to attend the trial when it started. Sarah was hesitant, since she didn't want Emily to see her father in such a painful circumstance, but Emily insisted. "Please," she pleaded, "Mom, I must be present." Sarah reluctantly consented. With her rabbit nestled behind her arm, Emily sat silently in the rear of the courtroom, observing and waiting. As the trial went on, the prosecution portrayed Matt as a desperate individual who had a reason to hurt Mr. Richards. Emily's hopes started to falter as witness after witness testified against him. However, something amazing occurred on the third day. Emily heard the prosecutor talking on the phone during a pause in the proceedings. He pointed to the absence of a crucial piece of evidence, a security camera that had been harmed during the break-in. Emily's heart was pounding. A few days prior to the incident, she recalled seeing Mr. Baldwin tinkering with his equipment next to that exact camera. She had even mentioned it to her mother, but Sarah had written it off as irrelevant. Emily was aware that this was her chance. "I need to talk," she said anxiously, pulling on her dad's lawyer's sleeve. "I have some knowledge." The attorney paused, looking at Sarah, who nodded despite her confused expression. That's how Emily, shaky but resolute, ended up on the witness stand, holding her rabbit tightly as she told what she knew. Emily's words caused the courtroom to explode, and the judge had to call for order. Emily, however, sat silently in the audience, gazing at Mr. Baldwin despite the mayhem. The sour old man appeared nervous for the first time, nervously nervous. Emily's words caused everyone to freeze. Just as the judge regained control, she answered, "I can tell you where to look. I can tell you where to find evidence if you don't believe me." The tension was intense and the room was electrified. However, the chapter was only getting started, so anything Emily said next would have to wait. There were frenzied whispers throughout the courtroom as everyone tried to decipher Emily's comments. The judge leaned forward, his face displaying a mix of caution and interest. "Ms. Thompson, you've made some very serious claims," he replied in a measured tone. "Could you elaborate on what you mean?" Emily paused, anxiously tinkering with her bunny's ear with her tiny fingers. Mr. Grayson, her father's attorney, nodded encouragingly, his countenance hopeful but pallid. In a state of amazement and terror, Sarah sat motionless in the gallery. Emily inhaled deeply before continuing, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was saying. "I noticed Mr. Baldwin close to Mr. Richards' residence. Just before the camera broke, he was repairing it. I believe he did it." Her statement was met with a startled hush. Mr. Baldwin, who was sat close to the rear of the courtroom, caught everyone's attention. The older man shifted uneasily, the scrutiny making his face flush. The prosecutor yelled, "Objection!" and suddenly stood up. "This testimony, Your Honor, is at best conjectural. She is a child and her statements are untrustworthy." The room became silent as Judge Whitaker raised a hand. "Mr. Collins, please sit down," he urged firmly. "In this courtroom, I will determine what is credible." His face softened as he turned back to Emily. "Do you have any other details, Emily? Is there anything that could clarify what you observed for us?" Emily gave a slow nod. "Indeed. I documented everything in my journal. Before the camera malfunctioned, I heard Mr. Baldwin speak to Mr. Richards. "You'll regret messing with me," he said. Mr. Baldwin's cheeks turned a startling shade of red as gasps broke out once more. He parted his lips as though to object, but nothing came out. The judge roared, pounding his gavel. "Order! Until called to the stand, Mr. Baldwin, you will not speak." Emily tightened her grip on her bunny and looked down. The tension in the room was oppressive, but she had spoken what she had to say. What if they didn't think she was real? What if it wasn't sufficient to keep her father alive? "You mentioned your diary, Emily," Mr. Grayson stated softly as he walked up to the witness stand. "Are you carrying it with you?" With a nod, Emily took out a battered pink notebook from her tiny backpack. The lawyer took it from her and carefully looked through it. As he read her notes, his eyes grew wide. He then faced the judge. "Your Honor, I ask for a break so that we can examine this evidence and investigate Emily's allegations." Once more, the prosecutor leaped to his feet. "This is ridiculous. We're letting an 8-year-old dictate the outcome of the trial." The judge gave him a stern look. "Sit down, Mr. Collins. The court will take a 2-hour break to consider this fresh material." People muttered, conjectured, and craned their necks to get a better look at Mr. Baldwin, who was now drenched in sweat, as the gavel slammed and the courtroom burst into mayhem. Emily and her mother sat on a seat in the corridor outside as Mr. Grayson and the detectives looked through her diary. With tears streaming down her cheeks, Sarah gave Emily a deep hug. "Why didn't you tell me any of this earlier, Emily?" Sarah's voice wavered as she asked. Emily whispered, "I tried, but you were always so tired. Additionally, I wasn't sure if it mattered. However, I felt I had to take action when I saw Daddy in court." With pride and shame battling inside her, Sarah kissed Emily's head. "My dear, you have such courage. I'm really pleased with you." Mr. Baldwin and his lawyer were arguing loudly nearby. His frantic motions and increased voice made Emily's stomach turn, even if she couldn't hear everything. Her mother's sleeve was pulled by her. "Do you think he's afraid, Mom?" Sarah's jaw tensed as she looked at the man. "He ought to be." The 2 hours passed slowly, with each minute seeming to drag on forever. At last, Mr. Grayson came over to them with a solemn expression. "Your notes were really useful, Emily," he remarked. "The investigators discovered an intriguing discovery. Not only was that security camera damaged, it had been tampered with. Additionally, they discovered fingerprints on it." Sarah's eyes got bigger. "Whose prints?" Mr. Grayson was unsure. "They believe they belonged to Mr. Baldwin, but they haven't confirmed yet." Emily's heart was pounding. "Is it okay for Daddy to return home?" Mr. Grayson responded softly, "Not yet. Although this is a significant step, we still need to provide evidence of Mr. Baldwin's involvement. In order to determine whether there is any connection to Mr. Richards, we will ask for a subpoena for his financial data." Emily drooped her shoulders. She had hoped that her testimony would be enough, but it appeared that much more work remained. "Emily, don't give up," Mr. Grayson said. "You've already accomplished something amazing. We simply require a bit more time." The atmosphere was considerably more strained when the trial resumed. Emily's testimony was dismissed by Mr. Baldwin's attorney on the grounds that it was hearsay, but Judge Whitaker rejected the request, ruling that the facts presented called for additional research. Regaining control of the story, the prosecutor concentrated on the initial evidence used against Matt. Highlighting the wallet and fingerprints discovered at the scene, he brought the lead investigator to the stand. Emily's heart sank as it appeared that the case against her father was becoming more and more certain. However, during Mr. Grayson's cross-examination of the investigator, a new detail surfaced. "Detective Harris, you testified that the defendant's wallet was found near the victim's home, correct?" Mr. Grayson stated, pacing in front of the jury. The detective said, "Yes." "Have you looked for fingerprints in the wallet?" The investigator scowled. "Yes, but only Mr. Thompson's matched them." "Additionally, were there any indications that the wallet had been handled by someone else or wiped clean?" The investigator paused. "We couldn't tell if the smudges were deliberate, but there were some." Mr. Grayson squinted his eyes. Is there a chance that the wallet was planted there? The judge permitted the line of questioning over the prosecutor's objections. Reluctantly, the detective acknowledged, "It's possible." Emily's heart pounded. Although it wasn't a conclusive response, it was sufficient to raise questions among the jurors, and at the end of the day's activities, Mr. Grayson made a daring request of the court. "Your Honor, I ask that Mr. Baldwin be called to testify in light of the new evidence and his possible involvement." Emily saw Mr. Baldwin's face go white as the courtroom exploded once more. The magistrate struck his gavel. "For the day, the court has adjourned. You are hereby directed to come back tomorrow morning to testify, Mr. Baldwin." Emily saw a glimmer of hope as the courtroom cleared, but she also realized that the fight was far from finished. She also sensed that things were going to get even more problematic based on the way Mr. Baldwin bounded out of the room. The courtroom was crowded the following morning. Emily's testimony and the judge's order for Mr. Baldwin to testify were swiftly publicized. Reporters crowded the steps of the courtroom, shouting questions to passers-by while their cameras flashed. The tension inside was nearly intolerable. Emily held her bunny close as she sat between her mother and Mr. Grayson. "Do you believe he will be honest?" Emily muttered to her mother. Sarah smiled at her encouragingly. "We'll find out, darling." The room fell still as the judge walked in. Already sitting in the witness box, Mr. Baldwin appeared much less assured than he had the day before. His attorney flipped through a pile of documents while seated rigidly at the defense table. "Mr. Baldwin," said Judge Whitaker in a firm voice, "you have been asked to testify about what happened when Mr. Richards was attacked. You get it?" With his eyes darting frantically about the room, Mr. Baldwin nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecution began by asking straightforward questions concerning Baldwin and Mr. Richards' connection. Although Baldwin acknowledged that they had lived next door for years, he said they hardly ever spoke. When it was his chance to cross-examine, Mr. Grayson stated, "And yet you were seen arguing with Mr. Richards shortly before the incident, is that right?" Baldwin's cheeks flushed. "I have no idea what you're discussing." Emily's heart was racing. She was able to see through his deception. He appeared to be an animal in a tight spot, trying desperately to get away. A witness heard you tell Mr. Richards, and I quote, 'You'll regret messing with me.' Do you deny saying that, Baldwin?" Mr. Grayson added, in a calm but firm manner. Baldwin stirred uneasily. "I may have said that, but it wasn't a serious statement." "Oh?" Mr. Grayson's eyebrow went up. "And how do you account for being spotted close to the tampered-with security camera right before the incident?" "I wasn't playing around with it." Baldwin's voice rose as he snapped. "I was repairing it." The judge slammed his gavel for order while the courtroom mumbled. "Repair it?" Mr. Grayson reiterated while pretending to be interested. "Do you frequently fix your neighbor's security cameras?" Baldwin's face became white as he opened his mouth and then shut it again. As he approached the witness box, Mr. Grayson remarked, "I didn't think so. Additionally, do you know why your fingerprints were discovered on that camera?" The courtroom became eerily quiet. Baldwin clutched the edge of the witness box with shaking hand. "I'm not sure. Perhaps while I was repairing it, I touched it." Dryly, Mr. Grayson remarked, "Convenient." He looked across to the judge. "Your Honor, I would want to add more proof to the file. A sizable cash withdrawal made just prior to the attack is one of the disparities in Mr. Baldwin's bank records that investigators have found. We think that a disagreement with Mr. Richards was connected to this money." Baldwin's attorney leaped to his feet right away. "Rebuttal! This is conjecture," Judge Whitaker said. "Overruled. You will respond to the inquiry, Baldwin." Baldwin appeared on the verge of passing out. It wasn't like that," he stammered. "What was it like, then?" Mr. Grayson exerted pressure. "Because I believe you had a reason, a chance, and the resources to hurt Mr. Richards." Baldwin's breathing was shallow as he gripped the witness box railing. "You're not understanding," Mr. Grayson responded sharply. "Help us understand. On the night of the attack, did you or did you not enter Mr. Richards' home?" Baldwin's mouth parted, but he made no sound. The magistrate bent forward. "Mr. Baldwin, respond to the question." Everyone in the courtroom held their breath. Emily's heart was beating so fiercely she feared it may burst as her nails bit into her bunny's velvety hair. At last, Baldwin whispered something to himself. Judge Whitaker responded, "Speak up. I had no intention of hurting him." Baldwin's voice cracked as he abruptly yelled. The judge hammered his gavel angrily as the courtroom exploded. "Put in order!" He let out a bark. "Mister, are you admitting to attacking Mr. Richards, Baldwin?" With his face buried in his hands, Baldwin sagged in his chair. "It happened by accident," he muttered. "We got into a fight because he owed me money. I only intended to frighten him, but things escalated." Emily was stunned. Shock and incredulity filled the room. With tears running down her cheeks, Sarah put her hands over her mouth. Mr. Grayson's eyes gleamed with appreciation as he turned to face Emily and nodded slightly. The courtroom emptied in a swirl of turmoil when the judge called for a recess. Emily remained sat, holding her rabbit close to her chest. She found it hard to believe. Her father was innocent. Mr. Baldwin had admitted. However, she observed something odd as the room cleared. Baldwin's attorney and the prosecutor were huddled together, their heads lowered. The prosecutor gave a stern nod and hurried out of the room. Emily pulled on Sarah's sleeve and whispered, "Mom, why did he go like that?" Sarah scowled as she followed Emily's eyes. "I'm not sure, my love. It might not be anything." However, Emily felt sick to her stomach. There was a problem. Later that night, while Sarah and Emily were waiting in the courthouse waiting room, Mr. Grayson came over to them looking distressed. He sat down next to them and stated, "There's been a development." "What sort of progress?" Sarah inquired in a cautious tone. Mr. Grayson clarified, "The police conducted another search of Mr. Baldwin's residence following his confession. They discovered some evidence that raises the possibility that he wasn't acting alone." Emily's eyes got bigger. "What are you saying?" Mr. Grayson paused, carefully selecting his words. "Some of the objects in Mr. Baldwin's home contain traces of someone else's DNA. He might have had an accomplice, according to the police." Sarah let out a gasp. "Who?" Mr. Grayson said. "They're working on it, but we don't know yet. The case against your dad isn't officially closed until they find a solution." Emily's heart fell. It felt like there was still more to discover, even though she had thought the nightmare was gone. She couldn't get rid of the feeling that the worst was still to come, as she gazed out the window at the sky growing darker. With troubled hearts, Emily and her mother returned to the courthouse the next morning. What could have been a victory had been clouded by the discovery of a possible collaborator. Matt's freedom was on the line, and his trial was still going on. Even though Emily was more affected than ever by her family's hardship, she remained adamant about standing up for her father. At the start of the session, the courtroom was strangely silent. Even though Mr. Baldwin had been arrested, his attorney was still there to represent him in court. Mr. Grayson got up to speak as the judge called the court to order. "Your Honor," he said, "the identification of a potential collaborator raises additional problems. Even though Mr. Baldwin's confession has clarified several aspects of this case, I ask that the trial be postponed so that the defense and the police can conduct additional research." Mr. Collins, the prosecutor, got up right away. "This is merely a stalling strategy, Your Honor. There is still substantial evidence against Mr. Thompson. Mr. Baldwin's admission of guilt does not absolve Mr. Thompson of any responsibility." To stop the dispute, the judge held up a hand. "Mr. Collins, the defense has offered solid proof that calls for more research. I'll allow a break, but as soon as fresh information becomes available, the trial will quickly restart. The day's court session has been adjourned." The courtroom started to empty as the gavel slammed. While Mr. Grayson was packing up his notes, Emily pulled on his sleeve. "Now what?" Her voice was small but determined as she asked. Mr. Grayson stated, "We wait for the police to complete their investigation. They are searching Mr. Baldwin's home for hints that could point to the accomplice. Everything could change if they discover something." Emily nodded. but it was too painful to wait. She wanted to do everything in her power to assist her dad go home. Emily was at home that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with her diary open. She was going over her notes, looking for anything she might have overlooked. Her father was still in jail, and her mother was in the living room talking softly on the phone with him. Emily's thoughts returned to Mr. Baldwin. She considered his terrified and irate appearance in court, as if he were concealing something even more heinous than what he had previously acknowledged. Something about the memory of seeing him argue with Mr. Richards seemed strange to her. "Why is an accomplice necessary for someone like Mr. Baldwin?" she whispered in her own voice. "He has always been so obstinate. He even dislikes asking for assistance." A knock on the door cut her thoughts short. Pale-faced Sarah entered the kitchen. She hurriedly said, "Emily, stay here," and went to answer the door. When her mother opened it, Emily saw a policeman waiting on the porch. In his hand was a little bag of evidence. Mrs. Emily screamed as the officer held out the bag and said, "Thompson," in a low voice, "I need to ask you some questions about this." There was a silver locket within, its surface damaged and its chain broken. Sarah scowled. "That's something I've never seen. How does that relate to us?" The cop paused. "Emily's fingerprints are on it, and it was discovered in Mr. Baldwin's home." It was a thunderclap of words. Emily felt as though the room's air had been drawn out, and Sarah's mouth fell open. Sarah shook her head and replied, "That's not possible. Emily has never visited his home." The officer responded, "I know this is shocking, but we have to find out how this occurred. Can we talk to Emily?" Reluctantly, Sarah nodded, and Emily moved closer, her heart racing. She remarked, "I'm not sure how my fingerprints got on that. I haven't seen it before." The cop dropped on her knees. "Think carefully, Emily. Have you ever handled a locket like this before? Perhaps you saw it somewhere or someone gave it to you." Emily's thoughts were racing as she gazed at the locket. Then it struck her like a lightning strike. She had previously seen the locket on the porch of Mr. Richards the day following the incident. It had been lying in the soil. She had picked it up, believing it to be his, but she had forgotten about it and dropped it on the floor as her mother called her inside. Emily's voice wavered as she replied, "I touched it once." "But it wasn't Mr. Baldwin's house. It was outside Mr. Richards'." Sarah and the cop looked at one another. "Emily, it is crucial information. We appreciate you telling us. We'll have to do further research." Sarah gave Emily a close hug as the officer walked away. She said, "You made the right decision, my love." But the complexity of this keeps increasing. 2 police vehicles were stationed outside Emily's house when she woke up the following morning. Sarah clarified that after spending weeks in the hospital, Mr. Richards had finally recovered consciousness and the officers were there to get his statement. Emily was filled with optimism. Perhaps Mr. Richards could explain everything if he could talk. However, the policemen's faces were serious when they returned later that day. Mr. One said to Sarah, "Richards doesn't remember much. He claims to have heard voices, but he was unable to identify the source. He also claimed to have heard something break, possibly during a scuffle, but that is all he can recall." With a wave of disappointment, Emily sagged in her chair. She had thought that the breakthrough they needed would come from Mr. Richards' testimony. Rather, it appeared as though they had to start over. Then, however, one of the officers produced his notes. He said, "There was one other thing." "Mister, one of the voices sounded familiar," Richards said. He claimed it was someone he had previously spoken to, but he was unable to identify it. Sarah scowled. "Maybe someone from the neighborhood? We're looking through records to see if anyone might fit that description," the officer stated. Emily's thoughts were racing. Could it be someone they all knew? Someone who had gotten so good at fitting in that nobody had noticed? Emily lay awake in bed as darkness fell, gazing up at the ceiling. Questions and possibilities raced through her mind, and as the clock struck midnight, she got a terrifying idea that she had never thought about before. What if the accomplice was someone closer than she could have thought, rather than someone from outside their family? She shivered at the thought and gripped her rabbit closely as suspicion and terror raced through her head. The truth remained hidden in the shadows, and the investigation was far from ended. Emily had trouble falling asleep. She shuddered at the thought that someone close to her family might be implicated. Clinging to her rabbit, she tossed and turned till the first rays of sunlight came in through the window. Emily was already dressed and sat on the edge of her bed with a resolute expression on her face when Sarah arrived to wake her. Emily remarked, "We have to figure this out, Mom. Time is running out for Dad." With a sigh, Sarah knelt down to look into her daughter's eyes. "I understand, dear. However, we are unable to resolve this issue on our own. The police are carrying out their duties." "However, what if they're overlooking something?" Emily persisted. "What if I locate it?" Sarah paused. She didn't want to depress Emily, but an 8-year-old couldn't handle the stress of the situation. "All right, let's just focus on each day as it comes. You've accomplished so much already." Reluctantly, Emily nodded. But she wasn't prepared to give up. She made the decision to spend the day reviewing all of her memories from the attack night. There had to be something distinctive. Later that morning, Emily flipped through the pages of her diary while sitting in the living room. She wrote out everything she could recall about Mr. Richards, Mr. Baldwin, and the days before the crime. She kept thinking about the same thing, though, as she was writing, the voice Mr. Richards had recognized. It wasn't just someone he knew. It was someone he had previously spoken to and had been close enough to plot and quarrel with. The possibilities rushed through her head. The obvious suspect, Mr. Baldwin, was already under arrest. Who else might it be? Then an idea came to her like a piece of a puzzle fitting together. What if it was a co-worker of his, she said to herself in a whisper, someone he had faith in? As she considered the individuals who had come and gone from Mr. Richards's life, friends, delivery drivers, contractors, her heart raced. Emily was overwhelmed by the list, but she wasn't prepared to give up. She had to look further. Emily persuaded her mother to allow her go to the park that afternoon. Sarah hesitated, but she could see Emily's restlessness. As Emily rushed off to play, Sarah, who was reading on a bench, said, "Just stay where I can see you." Emily didn't go to the slide or swings. Rather, she headed for the park's edge, where she knew Mr. Richards's house could be seen through the trees. She tried to think of anything that could be useful while she stood there looking at the house. She was standing thinking when she heard a voice. "Emily?" She turned to face Mrs. Taylor, the Thompsons' amiable neighbor who lived a few homes down. She was grinning broadly and carrying a bag of groceries. Emily forced a grin and said, "Hello, Mrs. Taylor." "You've been incredibly silent lately," Mrs. Taylor remarked. "How are things going with you?" Emily gave a shrug. "All right, I suppose." Mrs. Taylor gave her a worried look. "I was informed of yesterday's court proceedings. You have a lot of courage to speak up." Emily murmured quietly, "Thank you." After some hesitation, she made the decision to ask the question that had been bothering her. "Mrs. Stewart, do you know if Mr. Richards had any guests prior to his injury, Taylor? Was there anyone who looked suspicious?" Mrs. Taylor furrowed her brow. "He mentioned someone who had been bothering him, a man who came to his house a few times asking for money, but I'm not sure if that makes him suspicious." Emily pricked her ears. "Did he identify the person?" Mrs. Taylor remarked, "I don't know, but I recall him mentioning it was a former co-worker. He appeared anxious about it." Emily's heart was pounding. Could the accomplice be someone Mr. Richards used to work with? With her thoughts racing with potential, she thanked Mrs. Taylor and hurried back to her mother. Emily told Mr. Grayson and her mother what she had discovered that night. She stated, "It must be someone from his workplace. Someone he didn't trust, who he used to work with." Mr. Grayson gave a contemplative nod. "Emily, it's a good lead. I will forward this information to law enforcement." "But what if nothing is discovered?" Emily inquired. "What if they fail to notice?" Mr. Grayson reassured her. "They won't. They already have a lot to work with thanks to you. Please, just continue to be courageous." Emily nodded, but she was secretly uncomfortable. The picture was still fuzzy, but the pieces were beginning to fit together. She had a nagging suspicion that something significant was going to occur. Emily was awakened the following morning by her mother's phone ringing. Sarah's voice was sleepy when she heard it respond, but it soon became attentive and keen. "What? Are you certain?" Sarah's voice rose as she spoke. "All right, we'll be there." Sarah rushed into her room, her face white, and Emily sat up in bed. "Emily, please get dressed," she urged. "The police station is where we must go." "What took place?" With a hint of anxiety in her voice, Emily inquired. "They discovered something," Sarah remarked. "Something significant." Mr. Grayson and Detective Harris were waiting for Emily and Sarah when they arrived at the police station and were led into a tiny room. With a stack of documents in his hands, the investigator had a serious expression. Detective Harris declared, "We have discovered new evidence. Recurring payments to a guy named Frank Mitchell are shown in financial documents from Mr. Richards' account. He used to work at a construction company with Mr. Richards and is an ex-convict. Calls between Mr. Baldwin and Mitchell in the days preceding the attack are documented in his phone records." Emily felt nauseous. "So, the accomplice is Frank Mitchell?" Detective Harris stated, "We think so. A warrant for his arrest is being issued." Emily felt a brief sense of relief. Detective Harris was about to continue when a second officer, who appeared agitated, rushed into the room. "We have a problem, sir," he remarked. "Mitchell is no longer there. Last night he moved out of his residence." Emily experienced a chilling rush of terror. Mitchell was aware that the police were getting closer. What more might he be prepared to do if he was desperate enough to flee? Emily clenched her mother's fingers as the room sank into tense quiet. The danger was far from ended, but the puzzle pieces were starting to fit together. Frank Mitchell was hiding somewhere, and Emily suspected he wouldn't be leaving quietly. Detective Harris described the scenario, and the air in the police station felt heavy. The suspected accomplice, Frank Mitchell, was unable to be found. Emily tightened her hold on her mother's hand. She shuddered at the idea of a dangerous man on the loose. "Do you believe he'll visit us?" Emily questioned in a shaky voice. Detective Harris gave a head shake. "It's not likely. When people like Mitchell realize we're after them, they often hide. However, we're doing everything we can to keep your family secure." "Safe?" Sarah's voice faltered. "My daughter's name is constantly in the news, my husband is still behind bars, and now there's a fugitive who may be involved in all of this. How secure is that?" Investigator Harris held up a soothing hand. "Mrs. Thompson, I can appreciate your frustration. We're making every effort to get Mitchell in." Sarah's eyes were still burning with concern, but she nodded. Emily noticed that her mother's fists were clenched tightly when she looked up at her. Although she was aware that her mother was making an effort to support her, the fractures were starting to emerge. Emily whispered, "It's going to be all right, Mom. We will resolve this." Sarah smiled weakly at her. "I'll never be as brave as you are." Emily was awake in bed that night, holding her rabbit close to her bosom. Frank Mitchell was on her mind all the time. Where had he gone? What did he intend to do? The questions would not stop spinning in her mind like a carousel. She sat up at last and took her diary. She could at least attempt to make sense of everything if she was unable to sleep. She turned to a clean sheet and began to write down everything she knew about Mitchell, including the enigmatic payments, his phone conversations with Mr. Baldwin, and his relationship with Mr. Richards. Then she stopped and looked at the page. She couldn't get rid of the thought that had creeped into her head. "What if he returns to complete the task at hand?" she said to herself in a whisper. She was frightened by the thought, but it also made her feel oddly determined. There was more to discover if Mitchell was still out there, and if Emily was skilled at anything, it was discovering the truth. The tension in the house was evident the following morning. Emily observed that Sarah startled whenever the phone rang, and that she continually checking the locks on the windows and door. Both of them were aware that the police were making every effort, but the uncertainty was wearing them down. By midday, word spread that Frank Mitchell's vehicle had been discovered abandoned on a country road. Police found a mound of cash, a burner phone, and a piece of paper with multiple addresses scrawled on it. The Thompson residence was one of the addresses. Sarah turned pale when Detective Harris called to inform her. "What does this signify?" Her voice was trembling as she asked. "It indicates that he is cognizant of the circumstances," Harris stated. "However, it can also indicate that he was looking for somewhere to hide. Officers will be positioned outside your home 24/7 as part of our stepped-up neighborhood patrols." Emily could see the worry in Sarah's eyes, even though she nodded. Sarah murmured softly, "Thank you," and hung up. Emily saw her mother hide her face in her hands and sink into the couch. With hesitation, she said, "Mom, are we in danger?" Sarah forced a brave smile as she looked up. "No, my love. We will be protected by the police." Emily agreed, but she had a gut feeling that she shouldn't. Mitchell was planning something, not just jogging. She also felt like a target because their address had been in his car. The tension in the house was oppressive that night. In an attempt to escape the situation's reality, Sarah busied herself cleaning. Emily sat looking at her diary at the kitchen table. She felt powerless, as though she could do nothing to stop the universe from spiraling out of control. The telephone then rang. Sarah's cleaning cloth slipped out of her grasp as she froze. After a little pause, she picked up the receiver. "Hey?" Emily saw her mother's face get pale. "Who is this?" Sarah's voice trembled as she demanded, "What are you looking for?" Emily could not hear the words, but she could hear a muffled voice on the other end. Sarah's hands were shaking, and her knuckles were white as she held the phone. Sarah's voice trembled as she slammed the phone down, her entire body shaking. "If you come near my family, I swear," she said. "Mom?" Emily asked in a low voice. "Who was it?" Sarah initially remained silent. She simply gazed at the telephone as though it would ring again at any second. At last she turned to face Emily, terror shining in her eyes. She muttered, "It was him. That person was Frank Mitchell." Emily felt her heart race faster. "What did he say?" Sarah gulped hard as he said, "He claimed to be observing." The next few hours were like a nightmare. After Sarah called the police, they came a short while later to set up surveillance and sweep the house. Officers searched the yard with flashlights, their voices low and tight, while Emily looked from the window of her bedroom. Soon after, Detective Harris showed up and drew Sarah away to talk quietly. Even though Emily couldn't hear what they were saying, she could tell everything she needed to know from her mother's expression. Emily lay in bed with her mind racing as the night dragged on. She kept thinking that Mitchell was closer than everyone had thought. He had a strategy, too, if he was observing. However, what was it? The response arrived shortly before sunrise. The sound of breaking glass startled Emily awake. She sat up, holding onto her bunny, her heart pounding. Shouts, the distinct sound of a struggle, and the thundering of footsteps filled the house. "Mom!" Emily jumped out of bed and yelled. When she opened the door to her bedroom, she saw two policemen in the corridor grappling a man to the ground. Emily recognized him despite the hoodie covering his face. Frank Mitchell had stolen into their home. "Emily, return!" As further police arrived on the scene, Sarah yelled and gathered her daughter in her arms. Despite Mitchell's fierce resistance, the officers swiftly subdued him and placed handcuffs on his wrists. Mitchell met Emily's eyes as they pulled him from the house. A shiver ran down her spine at the icy, hateful look in his eyes. With a voice full of hate, he muttered, "It's not over. This is not the end of it." Emily's heart was racing as she held on to her mother. The nightmare was not yet ended. However, she experienced a glimmer of optimism for the first time. The truth was closer than ever when Mitchell was apprehended. In the hours after Frank Mitchell was arrested, the house was a flurry of activity. Every available space was occupied by police officials who took statements from Sarah and Emily, looked through the broken window, and dusted for fingerprints. There was a noticeable sense of relief that Mitchell was no longer evading capture despite the mayhem. But his icy words, "This isn't over," continued to reverberate in Emily's head. Emily sat on the couch and watched as Detective Harris came over holding a folder. There was a gleam of assurance in his eyes, despite his somber expression. "Could I talk to you for a minute, Emily?" he inquired. Sarah nodded while keeping a watchful eye on Emily. "Detective, she's gone through a lot. Don't push her too hard, please." Harris lowered himself until he was eye level with Emily. "I want you to know that even though tonight was frightening, you did something really courageous. We have Frank Mitchell behind arrest, and he will not harm anyone else because of you." Emily clenched her fingers around her bunny. "But it's not over," he said. "But what if he has other ideas?" Harris and Sarah looked at each other. "Everything he has said and done will be investigated. We can tell he's desperate because he came here tonight. We'll make sure he stays in jail because desperate people make errors." Emily felt Sarah's touch on her shoulder. "See, dear, this will be handled by them." Despite nodding, Emily's gut knot remained. She couldn't shake the idea that there was more to discover, that everyone was missing something. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table the following morning, going through the pages of her diary once more. Even though she had documented every element of the case that she could recall, one aspect of it remained illogical. Why had Mitchell visited their home? Sarah was pouring herself a cup of coffee when Emily said, "Mom, do you think Mitchell was looking for something?" Sarah stopped and furrowed her brow. "What are you saying?" "Well," Emily said, "he didn't hurt anyone, he just got in. Perhaps he was looking for something significant." Sarah, seated across from her, had a contemplative look on her face. "That is feasible. What would he be searching for, though?" Emily gave a shrug. "I'm not sure. However, it might be related to Mr. Richards." Sarah sighed, but it appeared like she wanted to reject the notion. "You could be correct. I'll let Detective Harris know about it." Detective Harris met with Emily and Sarah at the police station later that day. Emily presented her theory, and Harris listened carefully. He leaned back in his chair and remarked, "It's an interesting thought. Mitchell might have been trying to delete the evidence or looking for it. In any case, we must discover what he was pursuing." "How is Mr. Richards doing?" Emily inquired. "Is there anything else he knows?" "We've had another conversation with him," Harris stated, "although he still has trouble recalling specifics. He did bring up the fact that Mitchell was once employed by him at his construction business. It seems that there was some type of disagreement regarding unaccounted-for money." Sarah scowled. "Missing money? Was he being cheated by Mitchell?" "Perhaps," Harris remarked. "However, Richards lacked evidence at the time. That ended it, until now, when he fired Mitchell." Emily's thoughts were racing. Perhaps Mitchell attacked Mr. Richards because he believed he had proof of the money. "We're looking into that," Harris stated. "However, there is another issue that requires our attention. We discovered a notebook in Mitchell's pocket when he was being arrested. It had a list of names. Emily, including yours." A shiver went down Emily's back. "How come he would write my name?" "We don't know yet," Harris said. "However, those with ties to Mr. Richards are listed among the other names. It might indicate that Mitchell intended to attack them as well." Sarah's face turned white. "So he wasn't pursuing us alone?" Harris gave a head shake. "Mitchell appeared to be wrapping things up. However, rest assured that we are protecting each and every one of those individuals." Emily sat in her room that night and gazed up at the ceiling. Like a broken record, the events of the last few days replayed themselves in her memory. Each time she believed she was getting closer to the truth, a new jigsaw piece emerged. Determined to discover what she had been missing, she opened her diary once more. The list of names on Mitchell's notebook crossed her mind. There must have been a reason why they were all related to Mr. Richards. Then she remembered something like a lighting flickering to life. Mr. Richards's house. Everything had revolved around it, including the evidence, the attack, and even the malfunctioning security camera. What if Mitchell was desperate enough to risk everything for something that could be buried there? Emily leaped from her bed and sprinted to locate her mother. "Mom, we must visit Mr. Richards' home." Sarah gave her a startled glance. "What? No, Emily, it's too risky. However, what if anything is present?" Emily persisted. "What if Mitchell was trying to find that?" Sarah gave a head shake. "Leave it to the police. We shouldn't get involved since it is unsafe." "However, what if they fail to locate it?" Emily persisted. "Please, Mother, we can just instruct the police to search instead of going inside." After hesitating, Sarah let out a sigh. "All right, I'll give Detective Harris a call and share your theory with him. But you do realize that you're staying here?" With relief, Emily nodded. Although it wasn't precisely what she had in mind, it was still preferable to nothing. Detective Harris contacted the following morning to provide an update. He declared, "We searched Mr. Richards' property. Emily, you were correct. Something was concealed there." Emily's eyes got bigger. "What was it?" Harris's tone became solemn. "A secure location. It was concealed beneath a stack of outdated building supplies in the backyard. Although we haven't opened it yet, it might provide the solutions we've been seeking." With a worried and proud look on her face, Sarah placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Emily, you've done more than enough. Let the police take care of it." Emily's curiosity, however, was more intense than before. She kept thinking about the safe and what might be inside as the day went on. It seemed to her to be the secret to everything. But she was also aware that they might be surprised by what they saw when they opened it. The neighborhood had heard about the safe's finding by the time the cops unlocked the one they had located in Mr. Richards' backyard. Outside the police station, reporters set up camp and made wild assumptions about what might be inside. Emily and her mother waited for an update while sitting in the kitchen. Tension permeated the air. The phone rung at last. Sarah grabbed it and put it to her ear, her hands shaking. "Detective Harris, hello?" Emily watched with trepidation as her mother's face changed from astonishment to incredulity. "What are you saying? Are you certain?" Sarah questioned, her voice getting louder as she said. She hung up after a few seconds and turned to face Emily. Her voice was tremulous as she replied. "They opened the safe." Emily excitedly leaned forward. "What was within?" Sarah inhaled deeply. "It was loaded with cash, thousands of dollars, and—" She paused, her face going white. "They discovered a firearm." Emily's eyes got bigger. "A firearm? Is that the one Mitchell used on Mr. Richards in their opinion?" Sarah gave a nod. "To be sure," Sarah remarked, "they're still working that out. However, Harris believes this could indicate that someone else is involved, someone Mitchell hasn't mentioned." Emily felt sick to her stomach. Someone else. She recalled the names from Mitchell's notebook. Is one of them the true mastermind behind it all? Detective Harris showed up at the Thompson residence later that day. Spreading out pictures and papers about the safe, he sat down at the kitchen table with Sarah and Emily. "This is what we currently know," Harris said. "The quantity of money in the safe is the same as what Mr. Richards claimed was gone from his construction business years ago. Mitchell is directly linked to that. However, the fingerprints we discovered on the gun belong to a man called Robert Langley, which makes matters more complicated." "Robert Langley is who?" Sarah's face furrowed as she asked. Harris clarified. "He's another former employee of Mr. Richards. At the construction company, he collaborated closely with Mitchell. When the money disappeared, Richards dismissed them both, but we haven't been able to find Langley since." Emily's thoughts were racing. "Is he the one who attacked Mr. Richards, in your opinion?" Harris stated. "There isn't enough evidence yet, but it's possible. We do know, however, that Langley has a violent past and a reason for keeping Mr. Richards silent. He's dangerous if he's still out there." Emily lay awake that night, gazing up at the ceiling. Her mind was a mess of worries and questions. She kept thinking about Langley's name, the finding of the rifle, and the money. The parts of the puzzle still didn't fit together, but it seemed like they were getting closer to the truth. For the 100th time, she opened her diary and turned the pages. A memory suddenly sprang to mind. Something minor but persistent. She remembered seeing Mr. Baldwin close to the malfunctioning security camera that day. He hadn't been by himself. Emily's heart pounded as the recollection became more distinct. Baldwin had been with another guy, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar on his cheek. She had assumed he was either a contractor or a buddy at the time and had not given it much thought. Now, however, she understood that it might have been Robert Langley. With her diary in hand, she scurried to her feet and raced to her mother's room. "I remembered something, Mom," she murmured, jolting Sarah to consciousness. Sarah rubbed her eyes and moaned. "It's the middle of the night, Emily." "What's the matter?" Emily gasped. I think I saw Robert Langley. There was another man with Mr. Baldwin the day I spotted him close to the camera. He had a scar on his cheek and was tall. All of a sudden, Sarah sat up. Are you certain? Emily gave a nod. At the time, I didn't think it was significant, but now I'm positive it was him. Sarah picked up her phone and called Detective Harris, telling him of Emily's finding. Harris answered in a strained voice. Emily, that's a huge lead. Baldwin's involvement is confirmed if Langley was with him. We'll work even harder to locate him. Emily woke up the following morning to the sound of a disturbance outside. She could see police cruisers jamming the area as she peered out her window. Officers were knocking on people's doors, displaying their images and posing questions. Sarah clarified that they were using Emily's description to focus their search for Langley. Emily felt as though she was actually changing things for the first time. The cops were closing in on a new lead that her recollection had generated. However, the search produced no findings as the day went on. Langley was nowhere to be seen. The tension in the house became intolerable by dusk. Sarah continued to pace while looking for updates on her phone. Emily's thoughts were jumbled as she attempted to concentrate on her diary. Then there came a knock at the door as the sun was about to set. After a moment of hesitation, Sarah opened it to see Detective Harris waiting on the porch. He had a serious expression. "We located Langley," he declared. Sarah gasped. "Where?" Harris stated. "At an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. However, there is an issue. He has locked himself inside since he knows we are after him. His refusal to come out is evident." Emily's heart fell. "What is his desire?" Harris gave a sigh. Harris insistent on speaking with a person involved in the matter. "He claims to have information that could help us understand, but he refuses to speak with us." Sarah scowled. "To whom does he wish to speak?" Harris looked at Emily and paused. "He requested you." Emily's eyes got bigger. "Me?" People like Langley frequently become obsessed with someone they believe to be significant, according to Harris. "However, we won't take the chance because it's risky. I simply wanted to inform you of the situation." Though her thoughts were racing, Emily nodded. She wanted to know if Langley had any answers. However, the idea of confronting him was horrifying. Emily sat still as Harris walked away, her mind racing. Langley's connection with the pistol, the money, and the safe, all the signs led to something greater, and Langley now had the secret. But would the truth be imprisoned forever? Or could she find the strength to confront him? The tension was high as the night dragged on. Detective Harris said, "He asked for you." Emily couldn't get the words out of her head. It felt significant, but it was also unsettling and frightening. What on earth would Robert Langley want with her? Sarah had no intention of taking any chances. She double-checked the security system, secured all the windows and doors, and made Emily sleep in her room. They were both on edge because they were afraid Langley may try anything, even with the police outside. Emily's mind was racing as she lay awake and stared at the ceiling. What if Langley knows something important? What if the truth is delayed because you won't meet him? She turned and tossed, holding onto her bunny. She muttered, "Mom," into the darkness. Beside her, Sarah stirred. "What is it, my love?" What if Dad can be saved by something Langley knows? What if he's attempting to assist? Sarah let out a sigh, clearly exhausted. It's too risky. Even if that's true, he is untrustworthy. However, what if he merely tells me? Emily persisted. Shouldn't we listen to him if he wants to speak? Sarah rubbed her temples and sat up. "I know how you feel, Emily, but this isn't like reading a mystery novel or solving a problem. This individual poses a threat. Let the police take care of it." Emily didn't answer. The nagging feeling that she was intended to do something would not go away, even though she knew her mother was attempting to protect her. Langley was holed up in an abandoned warehouse, which was surrounded by police the following morning. For hours, negotiators attempted to calm him down, but he resisted. Through the barred door, Langley yelled, "I'll only speak to the child." "I won't say a word unless you bring her here." Detective Harris paced nervously inside the neighboring command center. He said, This guy is stubborn. He will not change his mind. Pale but determined, Sarah sat across from him. You're not really thinking of allowing Emily to meet him, are you? Harris gave a headshake. Nope, it's too dangerous. However, our options are becoming limited. This might become a confrontation if he doesn't come out quickly. With her stomach in knots from terror, Emily sat in the corner and listened carefully. But she knew in her heart that she couldn't watch helplessly. She had to do something. She inhaled deeply before getting to her feet. I'll speak with him. With a mixture of surprise and dismay on their faces, Sarah and Harris turned to face her. Definitely not, Sarah firmly stated. This cannot be discussed, Emily remarked, her voice shaking but adamant. It's my dad's life on the line. I have to try if Langley knows something that can help him. With a soft yet forceful tone, Harris knelt before her. I respect your bravery, Emily, but this is too risky. Langley is erratic. We are unable to ensure your safety. You'll be there, though, won't you? Emily remarked. You can ensure that nothing negative occurs. Harris looked at Sarah and paused. The risk is still very high. Emily begged, her eyes brimming with tears. I must do this. For my father. Sarah took Emily's hands in hers and knelt down. I know you want to help, sweetie, but I can't let you endanger yourself. Emily said, I'm already in danger. Langley is aware of my name. He is aware of our residence. He won't quit if I don't speak to him. Sarah sagged her shoulders and turned to Harris for support. A deep sigh escaped his lips. He declared, if we do this, we do it my way. She will be in a safe place, constantly surrounded by police. Langley stays far away from her. Sarah paused, tears welling up in her eyes. At last she gave a nod. All right. However, if she is hurt, it won't, Harris assured. We'll protect her. An hour later, Emily was sitting in a tiny room in the command center with cameras and police officers all around her. Harris was standing close by, prepared to step in at the first hint of trouble, and she was wearing a wire. Langley was pacing the warehouse outside, clearly frustrated. Harris said into the microphone, All right, you're alive. You can now be heard by Langley. Emily leaned toward the microphone, her heart racing. Hey? Vibrating over the speakers was Langley's voice. You're the child, the person who has been wondering all those things? Despite her dread, Emily's voice remained calm as she answered, Yes. My name is Emily. Langley gave a sour laugh. You're brave, youngster, I will grant you that. What are you looking for from me? Emily inquired. What made you want to speak with me? I would like to correct the record, Langley stated. You shouldn't be concerned about me, even though everyone believes I'm the bad guy. Emily scowled. What are you saying? Langley stated. I didn't attack Richards. Yes, I was present that evening, but I didn't harm him. That was all Baldwin had to say. Emily looked at Harris, who gestured for her to continue his conversation. Why are your fingerprints on the gun if Baldwin did it? Langley paused. Because Baldwin put it there. If something went wrong, he wanted to make sure I was held accountable. What made him do that? Emily persisted. Because Richards was covered in dirt, Langley remarked. Baldwin took more than just cash out of the business. Richards, who was prepared to reveal everything, was being blackmailed by him. In a panic, Baldwin made the decision to permanently silence him. Emily's heartbeat accelerated. Do you have evidence? Yes, Langley replied. All of it is in a ledger that Baldwin maintained. I had to assist him in burying it. But only if you swear to assist me will I tell you where it is. Emily's thoughts were racing. Langley might be telling the truth. Could this ledger ultimately clear her father's name if he was? Harris nodded subtly, indicating that she should continue. All right, Emily said. You must let me know where the ledger is before I can assist you. After pausing, Langley spoke slowly. It is hidden beneath the oak tree on Main Street. Behind the former office building. You'll find all you need if you find that. Harris signaled the negotiator to assume control. He muttered to Emily, We have what we need. Excellent work. Emily slumped back in her chair, her heart racing as the negotiator took over. The secret to everything might lie in the ledger. However, she also certain that Baldwin would not give up easily. The game had not yet ended. Detective Harris led a squad to the Main Street office building that had been abandoned the next morning. For years, the establishment had been closed, its walls covered with graffiti and its windows boarded up. An ancient oak tree with twisted roots that clawed at the ground like fingers protecting a secret stood towering and commanding behind it. Emily and her mother sat in an unmarked car and watched from a safe distance. Sarah wouldn't allow her leave her sight, even though she wanted to be nearer to see what the cops had discovered. Sarah firmly stated, "This is as close as you're getting. Leave it to them." Officers started digging beneath the tree while Emily held onto her bunny and kept her eyes on the situation. Her heart raced with every scoop of soil, and the minutes seemed to drag on for hours. Could Langley have been dishonest? What if nothing was present? One of the officers then yelled, "We have something!" Harris squatted beside the hole and Emily placed her face against the window. He produced a metal box that had been buried for years, its surface rusty and worn. He carefully pried it open, exposing a pile of documents within. Harris held out the paperwork and stated, "We need to analyze these. However, it appears that this might be the ledger." Sarah let out a sigh of relief. She turned to Emily and remarked, "Perhaps this is it. Perhaps this will clear your dad's record." Emily nodded, but her chest continued to tighten with fear. Even though they possessed the ledger, they were still in danger. Harris and his group rummaged through the ledger back at the police station. While the detectives worked, Emily and Sarah waited in an adjoining room, the hours passing slowly. Harris finally came in, his expression a mix of desperation and satisfaction. He put the ledger on the table and declared, "It's all here. The blackmail payments, the missing money, and possibly information regarding additional crimes Baldwin and Langley committed. This is sufficient to completely unravel the case. Does this imply that my father can return home?" With a glimmer of hope in her eyes, Emily asked. Harris paused. "We've made progress, but before we can have the charges against your dad dropped, we must provide a strong case against Baldwin. Although Baldwin has been adept at hiding his activities, this ledger is the crucial piece of evidence we required." Sarah wrapped Emily in her protecting arm. "How much time will it take?" "Not long," answered Harris. "However, we have one more task to complete. Baldwin must be brought in." Baldwin was taken into custody at his residence the next day. The neighborhood erupted in astonishment and conjecture as the news swiftly traveled. Emily felt a mixture of terror and comfort as she watched the report on television. Although Baldwin's arrest was a gain, she was aware that it wasn't the end. Tensions increased as the trial date approached. By asserting that the ledger was fake, Baldwin's attorney attempted to use him as a scapegoat. Because of his involvement in the crimes, Langley, who had consented to testify in exchange for a lighter sentence, came under fire. Still in detention, Matt awaited the day his innocence would be established with bated breath. The courtroom was full on the first day of Baldwin's trial. Emily sat alongside her mother and her father's attorney, Mr. Grayson, who had been permitted to watch the proceedings. Cold and defiant, Baldwin walked into the room in handcuffs. Emily felt a shiver go down her spine when his eyes locked with hers. Presenting the evidence from the ledger, the prosecutor did not spend any time. Every entry presented a terrible image of Baldwin's behavior, ranging from threatening Mr. Richards to embezzling business assets. Langley's testimony, which described how Baldwin had planned the attack to silence Richards, was just as damning. Baldwin, however, was not going down quietly. His attorney contended that Langley was an untrustworthy witness and implied that the ledger had been altered. As the defense attempted to raise doubts about the evidence and found flaws in the case, Emily's annoyance increased. Emily was exhausted by the time the court recessed for the day. "What if they don't think we're real?" As they walked out of the courthouse, she asked Mr. Grayson. "They will," answered Grayson. "The proof is strong. It just needs to be presented in an understandable manner." Days passed during the experiment, with each session being harder than the last. Emily paid close attention while witnesses provided testimony, helping to piece together Baldwin's crimes. When Detective Harris took the stand and assuredly described how the ledger had been found and verified, she felt a wave of pride. However, Mr. Richards' testimony was the most startling. His face was pallid but determined as he used a cane to walk to the stand, still healing from his injuries. "Mister, can you tell the court what happened on the night of the attack, Richards?" the prosecutor said. Richards inhaled deeply. "That evening Baldwin visited my home," he recalled. "He was enraged. He claimed that I couldn't be trusted to remain silent and that I would destroy him. He pulled out a revolver when I informed him I didn't fear him." Emily's heart raced as the courtroom gasped. Richard's statements validated all of their suspicions. "Then what took place?" "What?" the prosecutor inquired. Richards replied in a shaky voice. "I tried to fight back, but he overpowered me. He yelling at me to keep quiet is the last thing I recall." Then everything turned dark. For the first time, Emily noticed Baldwin's cool exterior crumble as Richards's testimony came to a conclusion. His eyes raced about the room as though looking for a way out, and his jaw tensed. The prosecution had piled up a ton of evidence against Baldwin by the conclusion of the week. Despite the defense's best efforts, it was hard to overlook the weight of the ledger, the testimony, and Baldwin's own personality. The jury then adjourned to deliberate. The hours passed slowly as Emily and her family waited in fear, wondering what the decision would be. There was silence in the courtroom when the jury returned. With a piece of paper in hand, the foreperson stood. "We find the defendant guilty on all charges in the State versus Michael Baldwin case," she said. Emily could feel the tears running down her cheeks as the audience erupted in gasps and cheers. The real relief came when Harris contacted them following the verdict, even if Baldwin's conviction was a victory. "We can proceed to have Matt's charges dropped with this ruling," he stated. "Justice is finally being served to your family." Emily's heart soared as she gave her mother a passionate hug. Her father was on his way home. A tiny voice in her mind, however, informed her that this adventure had permanently altered her family while they celebrated. She would never forget the lessons she learned about kindness, bravery, and standing up for what was right. Emily's long-awaited day finally came 2 weeks after Baldwin's conviction. Her father, Matt, was returning home. The case against Baldwin and Langley had been closed, and the allegations against him had been formally dismissed. Although justice had been done, the Thompson family's emotional damage persisted. Emily and her mother waited for Matt's release at the courthouse door. Emily's heart was racing with excitement as she held her rabbit close to her chest. She felt a wave of relief and happiness as the doors were opened and she saw her father go. "Daddy!" Emily sobbed as she rushed into his embrace. Tears were streaming down Matt's cheeks as he dropped his backpack and grabbed her up, holding her close. "My brave girl, Emily," he continued, his voice cracking. Sarah came over and put her arms around them both. "At last you're at home," she murmured. As the family held on to one another, the world briefly appeared to disappear. All that mattered was that they were together again after all that they had been through. For the first time in months, the Thompsons sat down to eat together that evening at the dinner table. In an attempt to lighten the atmosphere, Matt told amusing tales from his incarceration, and laughter erupted around the room. He said, "It turns out I'm terrible at chess," which made Emily laugh. "However, I did pick up some baking skills. I might attempt to make some for us." For the first time in weeks, Sarah's grin was sincere as she remarked, "That's great, honey, but tonight please no more jail stories." Matt laughed. "Deal." He looked to Emily with a serious gaze as the chatter subsided. "I'm not really sure how to express my gratitude, Emily. When no one else believed in me, you stood up for me. I am sitting here at this moment because of you." Emily looked down at her plate and flushed. "I only wanted to assist. I was aware that you didn't do it." Matt remarked, "You did more than help. Everything was altered by you." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she gave her father a firm embrace. "I really missed you." Matt kissed the top of her head and murmured, "I missed you too, kiddo. And I swear that I will never allow our family to experience anything similar again." The weeks that followed were an adjustment. Even if the reunion was joyful, haunted by his time in prison, Matt found it difficult to reintegrate into everyday life. In order to support Matt and Emily while working long hours, Sarah had to go back to work. Emily couldn't get rid of the memories of all that had transpired, even though she was glad to see her dad again. She received distinct treatment from her classmates at school. She was hailed as a hero by some for her role in the case's resolution. Rumors about her family were disseminated by others, whispering behind her back. Emily made an effort to disregard the criticism and concentrate on the improvements her actions had brought about. She was approached by a boy named Jack one day during recess. Although he had always shunned her, he suddenly had a nervous appearance. He shuffled his feet and murmured, "Hey, Emily. May I speak with you?" Curious, Emily nodded. "What's going on?" Jack said. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how I handled you. Because of what transpired with your father, my parents advised me to avoid you. However, I now know that he did nothing improper." Emily's heart warmed as she grinned. "Thank you, Jack. That is very significant." Jack paused. "You know, it took a lot of courage for you to stand up in court like that. I doubt that I could have succeeded." Emily gave a shrug. "I had to do it even though I was afraid. I was needed by my dad." Jack gave a nod. "Well, I'm available if you ever need anything." After a little pause, Emily held out her hand. "Friends." Jack's handshake gave Emily a sense of finality. She had learned from the experience how important it is to stand up for what is right, even when it is difficult. Additionally, it had demonstrated to her that compassion and empathy could heal even the most severe scars. Matt turned to Emily one evening when the family was watching a movie on the couch. "You know," he remarked, "I've been reflecting on all we've experienced. We ought to take action, in my opinion, to support other families much like ours." "What are you saying?" Sarah inquired. "People who are innocent but lack an advocate like Emily are among the numerous individuals who become entangled in the system. We might be able to establish a foundation or something." Emily's eyes brightened. "What a fantastic idea. Children who wish to share their story could get our assistance." Matt grinned. "Exactly. The Brave Voices Foundation is what we'll call it. What are your thoughts?" With tears in her eyes, Sarah declared, "I think it's perfect. Our family has endured a lot, but it will all be worthwhile if we can use it for the better." Emily smiled, pride filling her heart. She had always considered herself to be a typical child, but now she understood that even the slightest sounds might have a significant impact. The Thompsons collaborated to lay their foundation as the weeks stretched into months. They inspired others to stand up for their beliefs by sharing their story with local organizations, community centers, and schools. Emily turned into a representation of bravery and tenacity, demonstrating that hope can endure even under the most dire circumstances. The Thompsons were positive that their family was stronger than ever, even though the wounds from their experience would never completely heal. Together they had endured the unthinkable and emerged on the other side as advocates for kindness, empathy, and justice, in addition to being survivors. However, as they rejoiced in their newfound mission, a letter without a return address showed up in the mail. It included a single sentence: "The reality isn't always what it seems." It was written in neat, flawless handwriting. Emily's heart was racing as she gazed at the note. A fresh chapter was starting just when she believed the story was finished. The Thompson family was flooded with inquiries after receiving the enigmatic letter. Emily's thoughts were racing as she repeatedly glanced at the one line of text. Who was the sender? What was meant by it? And why now, when it all seemed to have been settled? Ever careful, Sarah called Detective Harris right away, and later that night he came to their house. He turned the letter over in his hands and studied it closely. "No return address, no fingerprints," he added thoughtfully. The sender wished to remain anonymous. "However, why?" Matt paced the room and inquired. "Is it a warning, a threat, or are they merely teasing us?" Emily's gut twisted as she gripped her bunny. What if Langley or Baldwin are involved? Perhaps they weren't being completely honest. Harris gave a nod. "It is feasible. There are always facets to the stories of people like Langley and Baldwin. However, this is merely conjecture in the absence of other details." "Can't you look into it?" With a hint of concern in her voice, Sarah inquired. Harris reassured her. I'll do what I can, but we might not get any answers unless the sender comes forward or gives us something concrete. The family sat together in the living room as Harris departed, the letter looming large over them. Uncertainty had returned, overshadowing the happiness of Matt's return. Life continued as usual during the following few days, but Emily couldn't get the letter out of her head. Its mysterious message, "The truth isn't always what it seems," kept coming to mind. What might that signify? Was the case more complicated? Did her father still face danger? She had an epiphany one evening as she was sitting in her room going through her diary. She recalled the ledger, the crucial piece of proof that had enabled Baldwin to be prosecuted. What if they had overlooked something in the ledger? "Mom, Dad!" Emily rushed into the living room and called. "Do you believe the ledger is still in Detective Harris's possession?" Perplexed, Matt got up from the couch. "Most likely. Why?" "What if the ledger is the subject of the letter?" Emily remarked. "Perhaps there is something in it that we were previously unaware of." Sarah scowled. "We've been through this before, Emily. The matter is resolved. Baldwin was found guilty. However, what if it's not truly over?" Emily persisted. "What if we need to locate more?" Sarah and Matt looked at each other. At last, Matt let out a sigh. "I'll give Harris a call, but it's unlikely. Asking won't harm." Detective Harris visited them at the police station the following day. In a separate area, he brought the ledger and spread it out on the table. As Emily turned the pages and carefully read the entries, her heart was pounding. According to Harris, the majority of these are financial transactions, blackmail notes, withdrawals, and payments. "What precisely are we trying to find?" Emily said. "I don't know, but I feel like we missed something because of the letter." Emily's attention was drawn to a minor item as they looked over the ledger. A payment to a person with the initials C was mentioned in one of the entries. It was dated only a few weeks before to Mr. Richards' assault. "Who is C?" Emily pointed to the entrance as she asked. Harris scowled. "We're not sure. We didn't look into it since it wasn't pertinent to Baldwin's case." "What if it matters?" Emily remarked. "What if CC is the individual who wrote the letter?" His curiosity aroused, Harris leaned forward. "It's worthwhile to investigate. Let me check our system for this." Harris gave the Thompsons an update over the phone a few days later. "We discovered who Site is," he murmured. "Cameron Tate. He was Baldwin's previous business partner. Years ago they had a falling out." "Does he have any knowledge of the case?" Matt inquired. Harris stated. "We don't know yet, but here's the twist. Cameron Tate vanished around the same time Baldwin was taken into custody." Emily felt sick to her stomach. "Gone? As if he's hiding?" "Perhaps," Harris remarked. "Or he may have been the letter's sender. We are pursuing leads, but it will require time." There was no update on Cameron Tate or the enigmatic letter for weeks. For the Thompsons, life gradually started to return to normal. Sarah resumed her nursing duties. Emily went back to her regular school schedule, and Matt began working part-time at a nearby bakery. But they had all been altered by the event. As the Brave Voices Foundation grew, it provided youngsters like Emily with a voice and assisted families in navigating the legal system. Emily turned to her father one evening while the family was gathered on the couch. "Do you think the identity of the letter's sender will ever be discovered?" Matt gave a soft smile. "Perhaps, but even if we don't, our accomplishments remain unchanged. What important is that the truth we discovered was sufficient to reunite us." With a sense of relief, Emily nodded. Though it didn't define them, the letter had started a new chapter in their lives. No mysterious message could erase the perseverance, bravery, and love that characterized their narrative. Emily's heart was full with optimism as she gazed out the window as the sun sank, bathing the house in a warm glow. She had discovered that it was worth fighting for, even though the truth wasn't always easy to find, and she was confident that her family would overcome any obstacles that were in their way.